welcome into the WYW Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm your host, John Burke, the Monotone Master, as you can tell, because my voice just stays at the same level the entire time. Our co-host today, Brian Timbo, the Fantasy Force here, as you know him, can't be here, so this is why we're in my photography studio. Has a little bit more for you guys to look at than just a bland background. But today's episode is advanced tips for the fantasy football draft, and we're going to be getting into ways you can improve your fantasy team by setting a better foundation at the draft. Because one thing to note is you're not going to win the fantasy football league at your draft, but it's very important to set a strong foundation for your team so you know the holes you have to fix and how you have to adjust your team moving forward. So as our typical intro, you can find us on TikTok and Instagram as WYWFFB and Twitter as You're Wrong FFB. And I just want to throw out there, we do this in our free time. If I had the time to just fully research every single player, stat everyone out, I'd be tweeting and TikToking and posting on Instagram all the time. But this is a side project for us. Even though we have been playing fantasy for years, we aren't experts, but we've been playing enough where we have tips that can help the average player, or maybe just remind the advanced players of things they should be doing to make sure that they stay on top or improve their team going forward. So some impactful news, as you've all probably heard by now, Aaron Rodgers, quarterback of the Green Bay Packers, has not reported to mandatory minicamp. He's requested a trade. The GM won't trade him. They're just basically at a standoff right now. But in other news, Falcons receiver Julio Jones has been traded to the Titans. So he's now with A.J. Brown, Derrick Henry, and Ryan Tannehill. So this trade is really great for the function of the Titans offense. It caps A.J. Brown's ceiling just a little bit. He's not going to hit those Devontae Adams numbers like people might have been hoping for. But this really just increases the value of Ryan Tannehill as a fantasy quarterback. He's definitely no longer a streamer. He's definitely in the top 10 quarterbacks, which feels really weird to say because our conception of Ryan Tannehill is being bad on the Dolphins, but he has turned his career around on the Titans. But I think the most important factor is that it prevents the defense from focusing in on A.J. Brown or Derrick Henry. Because before, if A.J. Brown or Derrick Henry, quote unquote, would go down to injury, the defense could focus on the other one and completely shut them away. This adds a third factor to that offense. So now if one is set back for a few games, the offense doesn't completely fall apart and defenses can't focus in on stopping whoever is left. So I would keep drafting the players of where they're at right now. I would just be able to be drafting them with more confidence than I had before. So now to get into the meat of it, advanced tips for the fantasy football draft. So tip number one is understanding the rankings. So generally, when you start a fantasy football draft, they've got all the players ranked from 1 to whatever, 2, 300 that are in your draft. So you really don't want to go by exactly what those rankings are, as we mentioned in the beginner episode. You want to know how they're actually broken down, because they're really broken down into the probability for that player to be the best fantasy player, but there's different positions that you need to take into account. You've got quarterbacks, tight ends, wide receivers, running backs, kickers, and defenses that you have to think about as you're drafting. So why are running backs and wide receivers typically ranked higher? So this is because there's 2 in each typical standard roster spot, because fantasy teams, as you know, can start 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, and a flex. And then the problem with quarterbacks is they score the most points overall, but they're so saturated and you can only start 1. So typically they don't go until later in the draft because the whole point of all the running backs and receivers going first. So you're trying to pick the running backs and receivers who will be scoring higher than the other players at that same position. Since all the quarterbacks score about the same, they don't typically fly off the board first because typically the top end running backs score a lot more than the low end running backs, if you kind of understand what I'm saying there. There are also only a number of set starting spots in the NFL, and the positions that have less starting spots will typically go before the positions that have more starting spots. So tip number 1, part 2. How many of those positions have high value? So there's 32 NFL teams. You might have 8 to 10 to 12 fantasy teams in your league. So let's just start off with running backs because it's honestly the smaller sample size if you think about it. So you want the workhorse, 3-down running back who tends to have the most value for fantasy teams. You also want to pick the guys who aren't in a committee backfield. What I mean by committee is that The team might have 2 or 3 great guys. You never know who's going to get the start, and you're never going to have the confidence to play one, versus a team that really just has one guy handle the running downs, the passing downs, and everything in between, so that you know he's going to be on the field for the majority of the game instead of a guy who's only going to be on the field for maybe a quarter or half the game. So with 32 NFL teams, there's about 20 that really focus on only using one running back. Then if you count the ones in the high-scoring teams that lean on the position, that brings you only down to about 10 to 12 teams. And one fantasy team can start 2 or even 3 if you can, 3 if you count the flex. So if you think about that, if you have 2 to 3 of the starting workhorse running backs on the NFL team, then you have about 25% of the best running backs that the entire league can have on itself. So what I mean by that in numbers, if you have 3, that means there's only about 8 running backs left for all the other teams left in your league. That's why I like the RB heavy drafting strategy. Again, going forward, there's about 64 to 96 quote unquote starting receivers in the league. What I'm saying is, so there's 32 NFL teams. Most teams have 2 starting receivers, so that's how you get to 64. And then there's a variety of teams that still have value in their wide receiver 3, who typically plays in the slot. So that's how you get to 96. But you really want to focus on the wide receivers and high-powered offenses, because if it's not a great offense, even though it's a big named wide receiver, he might not get the same fantasy value as another receiver on a high-powered offensive team. But the thing with receivers, they vary in type, and they can go from being explosive games to games where they kind of hide away and almost do nothing because they get shut down. So they kind of vary in type. There's the do-it-all receivers, your Devontae Adams, DeAndre Hopkins, who are the main focus of their offense. They can do short passes, they can catch deep balls, they get end zone threats, they can just do literally anything. Then you have guys who are so fast and just get an incredible high amount of yardage, like your Tyreek Hills. They just won't be able to be stopped because they can just get away from the defender at any point they want to. And then you have big end zone threats who might not get a lot of receptions, but they can get big chunk 30, 40, 50-yard plays, and they're big end zone threats. These are your DK Metcalfs, your Mike Evans, who might not have the best weeks sometimes, but they might explode for a 25 or even 30-point game. They get 2 60-yard long touchdown sort of situations. And then you've got your high reception guys, your Robert Woods, your Robbie Anderson, your Cole Beasley. These are guys who aren't going to be scoring a lot of touchdowns, but if you play in a system that is PPR, they're going to be getting a lot of catches, a lot of yardage, so it won't feel like they're having a big game until the end where they have about 20 points in just catches. Then you have guys who are incredibly boom or bust. This is Tyler Lockett in a nutshell. Talented receiver, but just because of game flow, they may have 5 points one week, or they could have 40 points on any other given week. These are typically your speedsters who aren't the number one target on their team. And it's going to be harder to predict when they're going to do well. But the game you get right, it's going to be very well in your lineup. So you don't want to depend on them as your wide receiver 1 or 2. They're great guys to have in your flex. So, continued on. 32 NFL teams, 32 quarterbacks, but you can only start one. And the amount of fantasy teams in your league determines how many of these quarterbacks will be relevant. So on average, if there's like 8 or 10 teams in your league, then really only 8 or 10 quarterbacks are going to have relevance, if you know what I mean. So typically, there's not much of a difference between the first quarterback and the 10th quarterback in rankings, even though the first quarterback might go in round 3 and the 10th one might go in round 9. Last year, the QB1 averaged 25 points per game, and the QB10 averaged 22 points per game. So why are people drafting quarterbacks earlier if they all average about the same? That's because typically the top 3 or 4 guys may have games of 25 plus points, where the guys below that might hover around the low 20s. And the difference of those 25 plus point games can easily win you a week if you're willing to take those guys a little bit earlier in the draft. For tight ends, there's 32 NFL tight ends that technically start. The only 2 you really need to know who are improved, okay, 3 because 1 was injured last year, is Kelsey of the Chiefs, Waller of the Raiders, and Kittle of the 49ers. Right now, those are the 3 top tight ends. Last year, Kittle was injured, but just to tell you the difference of the tight end market out there, Kelsey averaged 17 points per game and a half PPR. Waller averaged 14 points, and then tight ends 3 through 10 were lucky to average 8 points a game. So that's the drastic difference if you think about the differential of wanting to pick a guy who's going to outperform players at the same position. If you get a Travis Kelce, if you get a Darren Waller, they're going to constantly perform or outperform their other players at their positions, which will give you the point advantage going into your matchup. But the thing is, there's more tight ends drafted than just those three. So the problem is, the guys that are around tight ends 5 through 10, who are drafted in those middle to late rounds, those are guys that people are drafting hoping that they become a Travis Kelce or hoping that become the next Darren Waller. These are typically your tight ends who have had their main receiver on their team leave. They might make their second or third year leap. This is going to be your TJ Hawkinson this year, or maybe your Dallas Goedert, or there's a few other tight ends who everyone's like, okay, maybe they can make the leap. Rookie Kyle Pitts, for example. These are 3 tight ends who have a lot of volume they could be seeing this year and could potentially jump up to what Travis Kelce and Darren Waller or George Kittle do. But it's really hard to predict the outcome of these tight ends. So you really have to basically make sure you like the way your team is constructed before you go out and take one of them. And then kickers and defense. Why these guys drafted at the very end of the league? It's because the same reason for quarterbacks. They all score about the same. And it's so hard to predict what these guys are going to do each game. For example, kickers can be affected by game flow. They can be affected by the weather. They can be affected by how their team is playing. So it's best to aim for kickers on good offenses, but the best ones are on offenses that can move the ball but can't score, because that means they're kicking more field goals instead of extra points, because field goals are worth more even though they're still just kicks. So for example, that's why Jason Sanders on the Dolphins ended the best fantasy kicker last year, because the Dolphins were good enough to get the ball into the red zone, but they were never good enough to score touchdowns. So Jason Sanders was kicking more field goals than extra points. And then with defenses, you can pick who you think might be the one or top 2 defenses early, but the problem is defenses can be affected by the strength of schedule that they're playing. They're a lot more affected by several injuries, completely changing the dynamic of their team. And weather can totally impact how a defense is playing and who their matchup is. If it's bad weather and they're playing a bad quarterback, the defense is going to do better. And the reality of that situation means that there's defenses you could pick up weekly and stream them instead of having to just draft a defense way too early and then hope that they stay dominant the entire year. So you could be a team that picks the best defense first because they fall to you. Or if you stream a defense, it's not going to completely submarine your fantasy season. You just need to be making sure you pick the defense you want for the next upcoming week each week based off of potential matchups and the outcome of the weather. Okay, so what's the meaning of everything I just said? There are fewer running backs and tight ends that score higher points in comparison to the players at their other positions. QBs are saturated in points, which means they don't go till after the better running backs and wide receivers. So you really don't want to draft a quarterback before round 4. You really want to focus on the better wide receivers and running backs. There's a lot of valuable in wide receivers at different positions, and there's different types. So you want to make sure you know who these guys are, if in case you're picking a guy who's better at PPR or a guy who's better at catching touchdowns or the deep threat, because they vary a lot more than the running backs do. And then kickers and defenses are too hard to predict and are too affected on the outside variables each week to take early. And they don't score more points than players at their other positions to make up for it, taking them early or waiting until X round to draft them. They should really be your last 2 picks if you drafted your team correctly. Tip number 2, draft strategies. Don't take a player because he's the next ranked on the board, unless you're doing the best player available strategy and you believe that that's the right pick. You want to pick a strategy that suits your managing style, and it can be affected by which draft pick you get going into the fantasy draft. So the 3 main ones are RB heavy, wide receiver heavy, and best player available. And then there's a sub one that I like to consider called best position available. So RB heavy. Why RB heavy? So elite running backs are more consistent when it comes to scoring than the most elite wide receivers. And there are less elite running backs, and these guys are going to always be on the field regardless of what is happening in the game. So what does RB heavy mean? It means your first 2 picks, you're going running back, and then maybe even your third pick is a running back as well, because you can start up to 3 running backs at a time in a standard league. Going with top running backs, or 3 of them, means you don't have a giant hole in your roster when one of them has a bye week. That means you have 2 elite running backs left for when you can only play 2 of them at a time. And then knowing that there's better wide receivers in rounds 4 plus than running backs, it means you can draft the better running backs early and then make up the difference in wide receiver later in the round. The cons to the running back heavy approach is that running backs take a lot of hits, and during the season, some of them might have to sit out for periods of time due to injury. So how do you adjust for this? You draft the handcuff at the end of the draft of your most valuable running back. So for example, in hindsight, if you had Christian McCaffrey last year who went down due to injury, if you had drafted Mike Davis at the end of your draft last year, you wouldn't have lost the value of the running back position from that team. Now there's a difference between the 2 players, but Mike Davis wasn't going to submarine your team, as not having Mike Davis as a Christian McCaffrey owner submarined your team last year. So that's why Dalvin Cook, you draft Alexander Madison. That's why Christian McCaffrey this year, he used to draft Chuba Howard. If you're drafting some of the other elite running backs, they don't really have set handcuffs yet, but once the season begins, if I'm drafting an elite running back in round 1, I'm making sure to grab his handcuff in around 13, 14, or 15, depending on whatever is my last skill positional pick. Another way you can combat the problem of injury is later in the draft, picking a running back you like as your running back 4. So if you lose 2 of those guys due to injury, you still have a 1 guy to plug in with your other one to make sure your roster is still complete. So wide receiver heavy. Why would you go wide receiver heavy? It's because you're a risk taker. You really like the boom or bust performances. You really want a 200 plus point a week, and you're okay with taking an 80 point a week if it's not going to be that way for your team. So this is because wide receivers are more likely to have those games where they're just going 3 touchdowns, 200 yards through the air, but they can also have the weeks where they disappear for 3 catches and 30 yards so they get shut down. So most of the elite running backs are off the board late in the first round of the draft. So if you take a wide receiver heavy approach, you're most likely at the end of the draft in the first round. So the only guys left on the board are the top end wide receivers in the middle of the line running backs, and you're going to be in the position where you don't want to pass up on those elite wide receivers just to make sure you grab a running back. So players typically do this, as I said, after the top 7 running backs have gone off the board. So what is the wide receiver heavy method? It's taking 2 wide receivers with your first 2 picks, or even 3. You're taking the highest of high ceilings and accepting that mediocrity will be your running back position, but you're going for the big boom or bust play of your top end guys. So what are the cons of the wide receiver heavy? It's you're lacking the trustworthy running backs. So you have to drive the higher volume guys in the later rounds to make sure you can fill in your running back position. This year it's going to be Myles Gaskin or Mike Davis. Or if you have faith, you just want the mediocrity of the round running backs in rounds 3 to 4, you're going to be taking a Chris Carson in round 4, a Josh Jacobs, maybe Najee Harris falls to you. Now the problem is with running backs in rounds 3 and later, they have a higher bust rate, and you really don't want to bust with your third pick. If you're going for those high-end wide receivers, you have to make sure you get your running backs in the later rounds, because you don't want to get to the end of the draft only having 1 running back on your roster. Because the problem is, the other thing about this is, if you don't take one of those running backs in rounds 3 to 4, you're going to get stuck in the later rounds where you don't know who's going to be starting with the backfields like the Patriots, the 49ers, and the Bucks. They all have great talents at running back, but the way their teams play, either they're always getting injured or they're constantly cycling through guys. So even if you take one of them, he might not be playing the next game, or he may not get the full workload that the guys in the earlier rounds do. So that's just something you have to keep in mind if you're doing the wide receiver heavy strategy. So then there's the best player available strategy. So why would you take this approach? So this is when you don't love the idea of going with 2 running backs, depending on who's left on the board, or 2 wide receivers to start. This is you're taking who you think is the best player available to you on the board. So this could be taking the best wide receiver in round 1, then the best remaining running back in round 2, then maybe you go for that best player in round 3, and so on. So this is typically best for the guys drafting in the middle rounds, or basically right in the middle of the draft is what I meant to say. Because if you think about it, the guys in the middle of the draft only have to wait 10 picks between their pick and the next pick. in a snake style draft, which is pretty standard. Because the guys on the ends, even though they get 2 picks in a row, they have to wait 20 picks till their next pick. So because of that, at some point in the draft, if no one falls to them, they have to reach for a guy and draft him 10 to 15 picks early if they really want to make sure they get him, because they won't come back. Whereas if you're in the middle, you can basically be like, this guy fell to me here, and I can take a guy that's only 2 or 3 spots ahead of where he should be drafted according to these rankings, because he's right in the middle. I'm playing the average game. I don't have to worry about overdrafting a guy 15 spots ahead, because he'll come back to me before my next pick instead of me losing him to a guy on the outside. So the best position available, this is the high risk, high reward draft strategy. I don't recommend doing this, but someone out there in your league might do it by accident. So this is when they take the best player at the position they think they need to fill in their roster. So for example, they might go running back first, then they might go wide receiver, and then in round 3, they might be looking at their roster and be like, oh, I need a quarterback. So then they take Patrick Mahomes too early. Or maybe they're like, oh, I need a tight end. So they're going to take whatever tight end is on the board first. So if you go with this strategy, at the end of the draft, you might have the best talented player that you think is going to have the best season at each position. But then the depth on your team, your secondary players, aren't going to be strong enough. So once one of those starting guys gets an injury, your team's going to have a massive hole. It's going to be very hard for you to fix it to still be competitive with the other teams in your league. So I definitely don't recommend this, but someone in your league will probably accidentally do this, and they might get off to a hot start, but halfway through the season, their team is going to fall apart. Tip number 3, understand and pay attention to how the other teams in your league are drafting. Depending on where different players fall, they're going to pick strategies based off what they believe is best for their team. Knowing how the other people in your league tend to draft, knowing what players they really like, can impact the players who will be available to you. So if you're next to one of your friends in the lineup, you're trying to figure out what player might come back to you after he picks. Depending on who he's already picked and knowing the players he typically likes to pick, you might be able to look at the set of guys, know which guys he's going to take and which guys will fall to you. So that way you don't have to reach for one worrying that he might take them. You can let that player naturally come back and fall to you because he's going to be taking the players on the board that he wants instead of the ones that you want. So you can keep track of this with a small key. As the draft goes on, most draft picks have a minute, even though people like to make their pick in 10 seconds. Take the 20 seconds to write down each player that each team is drafting, or at least each position that they're drafting. And then halfway through the draft, you'll have a key to then figure out who has what player and then what position they might be looking for. So this comes into handy around 5 or 6 when teams might be thinking about making a quarterback or getting a tight end. Or let's say this is late round where teams have gotten the quarterbacks and tight ends, but there's still a handful of teams that haven't and you haven't yet. And the guy you want is on the board. And you can look at your key. You can be like, okay, the team next to me that's drafting right now already has their quarterback. The team after me doesn't have their quarterback, and there's only one left on the board. Instead of taking a second wide receiver or maybe the tight end there, I can make sure I can pick the quarterback that's on the board before the team after me has the chance to, sort of situation. So it's almost like you're already playing defense, basically making sure your team is complete and leaving another team out to dry in the draft, which can help set a stronger foundation for your team and put another team in a rough position to get an easy win later. That's a very low-end way of looking at the draft, but it's very vital making sure your team is set and founded correctly instead of you being in the position where someone else takes the player that you really need and puts you in a hole early. Tip number 4, you got to practice for the tilt or train for the tilt. So what is tilt? Tilt is when you are stuck between players and you don't know who to pick, and this is the worst feeling in the world. You will find it at some point in the draft because the guy you want is gone and you don't know who to take. So how do you fight this problem? You need to mock draft and research. The point of mock drafts is you get to practice any draft, any position, so you can see where you might be, where players are going, and if the player you want goes, you know who you can lean to or pick instead, so that when you do your real draft, if the player that you really want in that round goes, you can confidently pick another player without feeling like you made a grave mistake. So the research keys is you want to figure out in each round 3 to 4 guys you'd really like to draft. One thing to note and decide between the 2 guys or set of guys you're going between is what did the team invest in that player and has that player used in their system? Are they on a good offense or are they on a bad one sort of situation? Because he might be a more talented player, but if the other player leaning towards is on a better offense, his team uses him more, he's going to get more fantasy points even though he's a less recognizable name in the NFL world. You also want to figure out what is their past consistency and do they have an injury history? Is this player a guy you can constantly lean on in years past? Or is it a guy who constantly gets injured and you can't trust in your lineup because he might be great for the first few weeks and then he gets hurt and then he's lost to you for the rest of the season? That's a huge deciding factor on if you want to pick guys who have definitely been there and will be there for your team or might basically win you a few weeks and then disappear submarining your team. And then what is the strength of their schedule? So this isn't something you really want to focus on. This isn't going to be the difference between you taking a Christian McCaffrey and the running back 7. This is going to be you taking between wide receiver 20 or wide receiver 21, depending on how they're ranked. So 2 evenly talented players could have different outcomes depending on who they play against. Even though one player might be ranked a little bit higher, if he's playing harder defenses, if he has a worse quarterback, if his team is going to be in negative matchups with how they use him, the other player might be better if they have softer matchups, if he's not going against top-end defenses, and if his team plays a little bit more in the conditions that they'll be facing throughout the year. So even though they might be ranked similar, one of those players might have a better season if they're playing teams that aren't as good as the other player sort of situation. Tip number 5. These are your bench spots and they're super important. So I'm going to divide them up between bench hogs. Guys, do you want a hog on your team? Or bench clogs? Guys that are going to clog up your bench and only cause problems for you. And they won't do much benefit to your team. So your hog kind of players are the guys you took at the end of the draft. These are your breakout players. They're later round guys who might make that jump a few games into the season. But you can also just feel confident cut these players if they don't make that jump. You can have additional starters. This is going to be your 3rd or 4th running back, your 3rd or 4th receiver who's going to be replacing one of your starter guys if they get hurt or they're on bye or they just don't do as you think they will. And the guy on your bench that you drafted to be your 3rd or 4th starter is having a great season, and you can just switch those guys without feeling like you've really lost any sort of significant value on those players. And then you want to make sure you can grab your handcuff if you go running back heavy. So this is the running back slated to take over the workload if your top guy gets injured. As I mentioned earlier, last season this would have been Mike Davis with Christian McCaffrey. This would have been James Robinson when Raquel Armstead went out of the season early with COVID and James Robinson took over. This is, for example, your Seahawks running back when Chris Carson got hurt. Or there's so many examples out there, but you know what I mean. You want to make sure you have the running back that's going to replace the guy that you drafted early so you don't lose that value of that workload that you took early in the draft. Clogs. Players that you don't want on your bench. This is a backup quarterback. NFL teams have backup quarterbacks. Your fantasy team does not need a backup quarterback. Half of the league will have a top player, which means there will always be a streamer floating in free agency. There's probably about 15 quarterbacks that have value week to week. There's only 8 or 10 teams in your league. That means 5 of them, or at least 3 of them, should be floating out there. Drafting a backup quarterback means you have a guy on your roster who you're never going to play and is currently taking up a spot you could be using on a quality wide receiver or quality running back in case one of those positions gets injured and you can't fill it because you have a backup quarterback taking up an entire spot. That also goes for backup kickers and backup defenses. There's no point on having them on your team. Another thing you don't want on your team is a player to trade. Drafting an extra player thinking, I'll trade him to someone else throughout the season isn't going to work because all the other teams know you drafted him to trade him, so no one's going to trade for him, and he's just going to be taking up an entire spot on your roster, which could be a backup quarterback. For example, if you go 2 high-end quarterbacks, every NFL team knows, or every fantasy manager knows, you can't play both, so you're eventually going to have to get rid of one. So there's no point in drafting a player thinking you're going to trade him later. And then you also want to make sure you don't draft your opponent's handcuffed running back. So in theory, it sounds smart. I'm going to take the guy, so if their player gets injured, then I also have another valuable player on my roster. But the problem is, this will come to bite you if that doesn't happen. So if it doesn't happen, their player never gets injured, then you have this guy on your team that's taking up a bench spot that's giving you no value at all. And then if you have your opponent's handcuff and your guy gets injured, then you have two guys on your bench that give you no value at all that you feel like you can't cut. So it's basically a double negative drafting your opponent's handcuff. There's really no point to it. Now, if your opponent has your handcuff and his handcuff is on the waiver wire, you can pick him up and maybe arrange a trade so you guys can switch to basically add safety to both of your teams. But there's no reason to purposely draft your opponent's handcuffed in the draft itself. So to wrap everything up, a few extra bonus tips is don't auto draft and don't draft a player several rounds early because you don't know the players in those rounds. Don't draft a guy like Tom Brady in round 5 if he's going to be there in round 8 just because you know Tom Brady and you don't know the guys in rounds 5 through 8. You want to make sure you do enough research, practice enough mock drafts to know who guys are, know how they function on each team, how their teams value them, so that way you can build a great fantasy roster at the start of the season. So as to wrap this up, as always, follow us on all the social media sites. Keep track of NFL news. Mock draft every few weeks now, just to make sure you're ready for when the season starts this coming September. Cheers.